All right, so we're talking about Plato's Republic, jumping into Book Two of the Republic, and we've got arguments about the nature of justice and specifically objections to the idea that it's good to be just. All right, so my agenda here is kind of straightforward, but we can jump in how we like. Um, we've got at the start Glaucon bringing up some objections, making a case. So he does a little intro thing. Then he's got three points that he's going to make in this case that he's making, that justice is not desirable, or someone ought to come along and make an argument that justice is desirable. Then Adeimantus furthers the argument, specifically talking about religious beliefs, about the divine and the relationship between the gods and justice. And that's really the section of text that I have in mind for this class. I think we're wanting to spend some time thinking about the objections. Why does it seem to so many? Why is it hard for so many to see justice as a desirable thing? Why does it seem to so many that justice is a burden, or something that's not desirable, or it's only desirable for the consequences? It's only desirable if you can't get away with more. So why do we feel this way about justice? So I want to see it as a challenge that we should try to overcome ultimately. But then after that, there is a longer account where Socrates is starting to build something, and he's starting to build a notion of what justice would look like in a city. And he does this preliminary kind of economics, political theory. Where does the society come from? Where does civilization come from? Where does the city come from? And when he can give an account of it's not historical, I think, but the theoretical origins of the city, why we come together, right? The why of the origins of a city, then maybe we can see where justice and injustice come in. Now, given where we are in space and time, maybe we should talk about the city. And he talks about the difference between a healthy city and the luxurious city, which seems to have a fever. And there's things that perhaps we can't avoid talking about. And then he ends up talking about the role of the divine in maybe steering us from the feverish city back into a healthy city. Where does our stories of the divine, where does our theology fit into this? And it's really interesting because I'm also, with this background of I've got this deconstruction, reconstruction background thing going on. And Matt, I know you got the same kind of thing going on. Though maybe we're on different kinds of journeys in some ways. I don't know, we're coming out of, we're responding to some similar things, which is interesting. And then we're looking at a precarious situation for the nation. And yeah, it's interesting to look at. Because I'm seeing stuff about the problem of evil in here. I'm seeing stuff about perfect being theology in here. And really interesting things about kind of the history of, let's say, Christian thought, although it goes much bigger than that. But we're seeing things about Western religion, things that Western religion has picked up. But in the context of Plato, there's no revelation going on here. This is a discussion of theology that is grounded in prudence. It's grounded in practical concerns of what are the truths that we're looking for from religion, and then how do we craft our religion in such a way that we get what we're wanting out of it, which is really interesting to see the practical as a guide to truth in these ways. Really interesting. And my approach to Plato over time has I'm no Plato scholar, right? I'm an early modern scholar, just all you out there. I don't read Greek. I read translations. But I've read this over and over again, and I've taught it in intro classes over and over again, and some non-intro classes. And the more I read Plato in this context, the more I'm thinking that Plato, in so many ways, is a pragmatist about so much of what matters. So we'll see if we see this as we read. Before we started recording, Matt and I were also making connections to what we saw in the Euthyphro. Anyway, all right. So that's where I want to go, and I want to kind of just start at the beginning here and talk about the arguments that Glaucon is making, and what those should mean for us. Any other thoughts from you, Matt, getting us started?
Yeah, I'm kind of glad you brought the focus into that God section, because I felt like in reading that was what I probably considered um, the most interesting part.
Yeah.
And I found myself, it seems like these questions they're having about God seem very timeless, because I have asked and heard answers to a lot of these questions in very like conversations I've had in my own personal life. So it's and I found myself even slipping into a Christian mindset thinking about these, and I was like, it was so interesting to, like, oh wait, this is a bigger different, than the
Right.
God
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm used to, right? And I found it interesting that they're having these conversations, because it remind me they don't have texts, right? Their gods just like to be worshipped.
Well, so they've got the texts of the poets, right? They don't. They don't
Sure.
have. Are the texts of the poets supposed to be revelation? I mean, it's interesting to think about. These are questions I don't have answers to, but
Fair enough.
to look at ancient Greek religion and the notion of revelation and inspiration are interesting, because I mean we think of poets as being inspired in some way. They certainly think of poets as being inspired, but also as needing to be evaluated. Um, so I don't know. It is really
Yeah.
interesting.
So now remind me, we as the scholarly community believe that um, this was written by Plato, right? But did these actually happen, do we think, or is that
Oh, hmm. Yeah.
context?
So mostly not, right?
That's kind of the vibe I was getting, but I want
Right.
to ask, yeah.
Yeah. So it is tricky, but good question. Plato's Phaedo here uh, gives an account of the death of Socrates. And it opens with this discussion between Echecrates and Phaedo, um, and then eventually transitions into Phaedo telling the story of what happened at Socrates' death. So it starts, Echecrates says, were you there with Socrates yourself, Phaedo, on the day he drank the poison in the prison? Or did you hear of it from someone else? And Phaedo says, I was there myself. Okay. Now, and then Phaedo eventually goes on to proceed and tell us the story. But as he's telling us the story, he tells us who was there, and he goes out of his way to say that Plato was not there. Plato was busy. Plato couldn't make it for some reason. And it's kind of like, why would he tell us this? Well, partly, I think, because this isn't going to be a historical account. Similarly, and I could bring this up as an example of sexism in Plato's works too, right? they when Socrates' friends arrive, his wife Xanthippe is there, and Xanthippe has an emotional outburst, which seems appropriate for the setting, right? Oh, Socrates, this is the last time you'll ever talk with your friends, and they with you. So sad. Um, to which Socrates responds not to Xanthippe, but to one of the friends. Why don't you take her away? uh, Indicating that this isn't going to be an emotional account. I mean, this is what I think is going on, right? Xanthippe is here, the only woman here, representing emotionality in some way. Be nice if we had women characters that weren't just representing something to then be, removed from the conversation. So take her away. Uh, we're going to have a rational discussion about death. And in fact, I'm going to console you, friends, because the friends are sad too. And it's Socrates' job to console them and argue that death isn't actually a bad thing. So is Plato wanting us to think that here's an account of how Socrates actually died and the conversation that happened? No, because I don't think he'd be telling us right at the beginning that Plato wasn't there, right? Let's give an account of death. We're going to write a dialogue about the nature of death, about whether death is a good thing and how we should prepare for it, right? We want to think about this. What's the appropriate literary setting for this for someone like Plato? We'll put it we'll put the setting at the death of Socrates, and we'll have this wise man give us, the courage we need to think about this rightly and face it rightly and all that, right? So much of the time, the point isn't to give us a historical account, right? For instance, another example, literary example that's probably familiar to a lot of us is the Book of Job. Uh, if you look at the Book of Job as history, which is not how we look at the Book of Job generally, okay, well, why is it written the way it's written? The details of the place and time are in some ways obscure. To the extent that we have details about place and time, it's far removed from the author. This is a long ago kind of thing. And we have kind of these really great literary features there where we've got a prose introduction and a prose conclusion to the Book of Job, and then in the middle we've got all this gorgeous poetry, and we've got structures of he's got these things and then he loses these things and then he's given these things back, right? The elegance of it, it's not what you'd expect of like pure history, right? The elegance of it is not what you'd expect of pure history. Now, the apology is a little different. In Plato's Apology, he gives us some reasons to think that maybe this is, in some ways, a historical account. Lots of people were there. He tells us the people who were there, the people who would have known, right? So you can distinguish sometimes, but largely, we're wanting, like Ecclesiastes or like Job, right? We're wanting to think carefully about the topic here, and we're wanting a situation. We're wanting a group of people to talk about this. We're wanting a setting that does justice to the topic, and maybe even gives us, I mean, like we saw in Euthyphro, I think, gives us even more, right, that we can analyze than just the way the words are coming out. So, yeah, that did this conversation happen? I mean, did it happen in 10 books? I mean, no, come on. Uh, this is a work of art. I mean, this is a masterful work of art. And works of art sometimes are made about and around things that actually happen, but works of art tend to not be true to the things that happen. And in fact, uh, I don't know. Even when we think about how Plato is talking about how to teach people here, about education here, it would be uh, he wouldn't be doing his job properly if he was uh, overly fastidious with the facts, right? Anyway, other things, other preliminary things before we start looking at the content.
Yeah, I was just thinking, despite the fact that this may not be historically what happened, I don't think that we can also say that it's untrue. Because I feel like there's a lot of, I guess I wouldn't, I don't know, universal truths may not be quite the right term, but there's definitely something true about this account that, despite it maybe not necessarily happen, it can still be an important way to learn, I guess. So
Yeah,
I don't want, oh, this didn't happen, this is not valuable kind of thing. I don't think that's the way to go about it.
right, right. Oh, this is the right conversation to have right here because then it's the right question to bring up because then when we start looking at uh, the accounts of the stories that we tell for education purposes, uh, I don't know. We kind of it circles back on it in a very platonic way, nicely. I don't know. It's good.
I'm often reminded of in conversations like this, I'm often reminded of George Washington and the cherry tree. Like we
Yeah.
all know he didn't chop down the cherry tree, but we also know that the point of that story is to show Washington as an upright and honest man, which I think most people actually think is true.
I mean, well,
Yeah,
right. It's the truth that's meant to be communicated there, right? Whether it's true or propaganda, it's the truth that's meant to be presented. Yeah, yeah. So if we take a genre question, say, is this fiction or nonfiction? I mean,
yes and
eh,
no,
right.
both and neither.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing because in some ways this is a story of a conversation. The conversation, didn't happen. So you could say it's fiction, but they're discussing and reasoning about various things that are, I mean, true in some sense. Yeah, Aesop's fables also is in the background here of what sort of things should we be presenting? And actually, in the Phaedo, did I bring this up? Uh, I might have brought this up last time. When the friends arrive, they're curious to find that Socrates has been writing, and he's been writing poetry, and he's putting to verse the fables of Aesop because he's had this dream all his life that the gods come and tell him to make art. He says, "Well, I thought that they were always just encouraging me to keep doing what I'm doing because philosophy is the greatest of arts. So make art." But then, as his death is approaching, he says, "Well, maybe I should make some poetry too, just in case." Uh, but there we've got weird little independent testimony from the Phaedo that Socrates is going to appreciate Aesop's fables as a source of truth. It's interesting. That those are the kinds of stories I think that Plato wants us to learn, and in a lot of ways, the Greek stories are like that. Um, the poets give portrayals of virtue and vice that are meant to be, vice comes back on people's heads and it's a bad thing, right? A lot of these stories uh, are such ways, but we should be careful about the gods. The role of the gods in Plato's education of the city here is really interesting. And I wonder if it's because that's what he thinks the role of the gods should be, or I wonder if he's looking at his city and thinking this is the role that people are putting the gods to, and which we saw in the Euthyphro. Yeah, so yeah, if this follows more nicely than I anticipated. It's not me. This follows more nicely the Euthyphro than I was expecting on this reading through, especially because of the second half that was not on my mind when I was, assigning this. Okay, but let's jump into the first half. All right, we begin. Glaucon saying, "Look, Socrates, do you want to have convinced us that Thrasymachus was wrong? Thrasymachus is saying that it's better to be unjust. Justice is a vice. The life of injustice is really worth pursuing. The life of justice, when we pursue it, we're reluctant to pursue it. We pursue it uh, reluctantly because there's not a better option for us. Do you really want to have persuaded us, Socrates, that justice is good, a great good, or do you only want to appear to have convinced us?" Uh, so Glaucon and Adeimantus start playing the role of the devil's advocate. We're going to make the account as clearly as we can that justice is a bad thing, or at least not one of the greatest goods. It's not desirable for its own sake, but only for what it gets you. That'd be awful. And then we'll see if Socrates can convince us otherwise, which we don't actually get into the full account in this section. Of course, it's a long book, but that's where we are. So he begins, Glaucon, by breaking up the desirable into three categories. There's those things that are desirable for their own right, for their own sake. We want them not because of what they give us. We want them primarily for themselves, like joy. I don't want to feel joy for my mental health. I mean, I do, but that's not why I'm after joy, right? Joy is good in its own sake, for its own sake. There are other things that are we want them for themselves, but also for what they give us, like maybe skill. I want to be skilled. It's good to be skilled. It feels good to be skilled. It's a good quality to have. But also because of what being skilled can get me in various ways. And then there's those things that we actually don't want except for what they give us. My child's shot. My own shot. I mean, to be honest, I don't like shots. I really don't like shots, actually, but I get them. Not because, oh, I really would like you to put a needle in my arm, but for the benefits or a bitter medicine, right? We don't want it. We don't want to drink the bitter medicine because it's good. We want to drink the bitter medicine because of the effects. Money, lest people be confused, we don't want money for its own sake. We work to get money only reluctantly if we're wise. If we're not complete idiots, we work to get money only reluctantly because we know we need what the money will get us. All right, so there are these categories of good. Very clearly, those that we don't want for their own sake, but only for what they get us, are the worst. Very clearly, those goods, the goods that are only good for what they get us, only good because of the consequences, those are worse than the others. Justice, surely, I mean, hopefully, we trying to live good lives here want to believe that justice is one of the greater things, one of the things that's good for us, even if it didn't get us everything. It's but Glaucon and Adeimantus are worried that it's actually better. We're worried that people who pursue justice only for what it gets them, maybe they're the ones who are right. Maybe they're the ones who are seeing this most clearly. So they're not going to be arguing that it's just going to be better to be unjust for everyone. They're going to argue, even if for most people you should try to be just, it's really only for what it gets you. It's really only to keep you out of trouble. And in fact, Epicurus kind of makes this claim about justice too. Right? This isn't an argument that like no philosophers accept. No, like there's a lot of people who think that you should really only be just because it keeps you out of trouble. Epicurus says that what's good is pleasure and the absence of pain, and what's bad is pain and worry and sadness and all those related things. So really, Epicurus says, the reason you should be good, the reason you should be a good person and follow the rules, if that's what justice is, just following the rules, it's just so you don't have to worry about being found out. So you don't have to worry about being punished. If you weren't worried about being punished or worried about being found out, if you could avoid ever being worried about being punished or being found out, there'd be no reason to be good. This is a disturbing position for Glaucon and Adeimantus, but one that they kind of like can't avoid. What if the crooks are right? What if the crooks are right? I mean, we should worry about this, especially because I think, Matt and I were talking about our kids earlier, right? We want to tell our children, hey, it's good to be good. It really is. And we want to believe, actually, the implications of this are far reaching, right? I want to believe that it's good to be good so I can trust other people too, like intimately trust other people. That's bad behavior is punished, that being bad is punished in society is, something. Thomas Hobbes says that this is really why we trust people, because there is an outside force, not the divine here, but the sovereign, the government, that will punish people for, murdering and stuff. So you don't have to walk around the street worried about being murdered because there's a government that'll punish people. So we can trust people, yay. And we can trust the government because if society falls apart, we're coming for the government. The government's power only comes from the lack of civil unrest. And if they can't maintain order, then we're gonna take over. Listen up, government. Anyway, but still, I mean, people like Leibniz read Hobbes and say, isn't there something more? Isn't there a justice that's more meaningful than even just, there's punishments in this life or maybe in the next? After all, maybe there aren't. So Glaucon is trying to make this argument as strongly as possible, and he does a good job. So he sets up the account, right? So there's these different kinds of goods. There's those that are really good. We want them for their own sake. And then there's those that we want them only reluctantly because of what they can get us. We'd rather not have the bitter medicine. We'd rather not have the shot, but we'll put up with it because we know of the good that it gets us. So Glaucon says, we're going to do three things here. First, we're going to talk about what justice is said to be, the origins of justice, where it comes from, what it's said to be. Second, we're going to make the argument that people practice justice only unwillingly. And then third, we're going to make the case that the life of the unjust is actually preferable to the life of the just. Maybe he hedges on that a little bit, but he does a good job still. Okay, so first, the nature and origin, and this is what I think of as the cynical social contract. People will look to this text as kind of an origin of a social contract. but it is kind of like it's a cynical social contract. It's a liar's social contract, maybe ultimately. Um, so if you look at life, clearly the best you'd want, right? I mean, if justice is about getting what you're owed, giving to people what they're owed, there's a certain common sense way in which it's clearly more beneficial to be unjust if you could get away with it. Suppose we had a simple exchange of goods, right? You promised me this, and I promised you that, right? We're going to make a trade. Clearly, what would be best for me is to be unjust, but not suffer injustice. Because then I'd have both things. If I could get what you promised me and keep what I promised you, then I've got both things better for me, right? Very clearly. Um, the worst for me would be to be just, to give what I promised you, but to suffer injustice, to not have what you promised me, right? If I could go around screwing people over, but not getting screwed over myself, that's going to be the best for me in a very obvious way. So why do people go around saying, what a good thing it is to be just? Look how just I am. The idea is to put it out there like propaganda. So hopefully you can get the best result for yourself, actually, right? It's scoundrels or people who are worried that they couldn't get away with being scoundrels, who are going to tell you, hey, it's good to be just. Like we all are kind of agreeing together, you know what? Maybe although I'd like to be able to get away with screwing people over, maybe the best situation that we could all agree on is to not screw people over and not get screwed over. So let's all praise justice, let's all be just, and let's all villainize the unjust. So hopefully we can all get what we want. But if that's what justice is, and if that's what justice comes from, it comes from this cynical social contract, then we're not all really secretly wanting to be just for ourselves. We're not wanting to be just for its own sake. We're settling for justice. We're settling for society that prioritizes justice because I'm not confident that I could get away with being unjust without being screwed over myself. So where justice comes from, he says, is from this kind of social contract. But I mean, it's probably a lie, right? Uh, I mean, I'm reminded of I mean, the very straightforward example of like psychological projection of cheaters and romantic relationships, right? Someone who says, "No, what I really want is a faithful monogamous relationship. That's really what I think is the best thing." But then goes around suspicious that their partner is going to be cheating on them all the time and wanting to check in on their partner and wanting to surveil their partner. Why? Because they're worried that their partner also secretly thinks that maybe what would be best is if my partner were faithful, but I didn't have to be. Right? I mean, if we could cheat, but the other people couldn't, maybe that's what would be best. Right? So Glaucon is kind of saying, hey, what if, what everyone's saying in society, what if they're not serious about it? What if they're not trustworthy? Sure, I think it's good to be just, but we really need something. Socrates, give us something so we can really trust each other. Show us how it really is best to be just. All right, but he makes this argument that, if justice comes from this kind of social contract that we're all kind of agreeing to praise justice so hopefully we don't get screwed over, that's not what we need. That's not good enough. And then he goes on to make his second point. All right, so if that's where justice comes from, then maybe it's not really pursuable. Second point, if people were really honest with themselves and had the opportunity, we'd see that no one would willingly choose to be just. Right? And this is where he tells the story of the ring of Gyges, right? If you found a ring that could make you invisible, well, we've got this tale of the ring of Gyges where this shepherd finds a ring, you turn the ring around, you're invisible. What does he do? Seduces the queen, kills the king, takes over the kingdom, enriches themselves, right? All these unjust things, clearly unjust. All right, so Glaucon says, suppose we had two of these rings and we gave one, we found a just person and we gave them the just ring. We found the just person, we gave them a ring. We found an unjust person and gave them a ring. Would they act differently? And he says, we're not going to give this ring to a just person or an unjust person because we're not going to trust anyone to act justly in these kinds of conditions, right? With this kind of power. So if we're not going to trust anyone, if we're not going to believe that the just and the unjust alike might do good things with it, then we know that justice isn't really worth pursuing. All right, so not only does the origin of justice not convince us that it's a good thing, but also these stories and our suspicions of each other make us think that maybe, yeah, like we all secretly know that it's not worth pursuing on its own. And then thirdly, he makes the argument that actually a life of perfect injustice is going to be more profitable. It's clearly more profitable to be unjust if you can get away with it than to be just. And the way he does this is kind of clever, right? Let's separate the virtue from the reputation. Suppose we had a person of great virtue, a perfectly just person, well practiced in justice, always gives to those what they're due. And let's contrast that with the life of a scoundrel who's perfectly unjust. But then let's separate their reputations and invert them. Suppose that the perfectly just person had a reputation of being a scoundrel. What kind of life would they lead? And actually, it's not hard to imagine that a perfectly just person would get such a reputation either. After all, are they going to be defending themselves with everything that at their disposal? Are they going to be concerned first and foremost about their reputation, or maybe about what's right for the people around them? It's not hard to imagine this, and in a society where you can see people getting arrested for feeding the poor, or housing the poor, or employing the poor, it's not hard to imagine that you could get in trouble for being a virtuous person. You could have your reputation tarnished for being a good person. I mean, I'm also thinking about Bishop Buddy here. Okay. Also, it's not hard to imagine that a life of perfect injustice could get you a reputation for being a just person. You use the ill-got gains to control your reputation. It's not hard to imagine that someone who's very skilled at living an unjust life could arm themselves with a reputation for justice of everything that social standing could get them. So being perfectly just and being perfectly unjust, whose life are we going to pursue here? Whose life seems the most profitable? And and this isn't just Plato, right? If we're wondering, does Western religion elsewhere, make these kinds of claims? Well, why do the wicked prosper? I think that religion tells me that it's good to be good, but then religion also bemoans the fact that the good people are being put down, and you could use put down in a couple different senses there, sadly. Put down like animals, or put down like uh, an insult. Both happen. And when the wicked are exalted, well, they're able to exalt themselves, and then they're able to be praised uh, as virtue. Ugh. Okay, so are there really rewards to being good here? I what do we do with arguments like this? What do we do with texts like these? I think it motivates us, and it sets an agenda for us. When we think about morality, when we think about what it is to live a good life, these are challenges for us. And we need to be challenged in exactly this way, right? If we're not challenged in exactly this way, if we're not told, hey, you know what? Prospering in this world might not be a sign that you're living rightly, then maybe we'll never question uh, what's shown to us, what the paths to happiness that are given to us. Pursuing happiness is part of living a good life, I think. Pursuing joy. I mean, actually, we already see in this text that happiness, joy, is worth pursuing for itself. We pursue that for itself. But if our pursuit of happiness, our pursuit of joy, uh, leads us to not worry about justice, right? All the more reason we need to think very carefully about why justice might be, probably as hopefully is one of those things worth pursuing in its own sake, for its own sake. These arguments make it seem like, well, you know what? You could probably do pretty good uh, pursuing a life of injustice. You could probably do pretty good. All right. Reflections so far. We'll move on to Adeimantus here.
Yeah, it seems like when you're living in, for lack of a better term, a dysfunctional society, and you're prospering in that dysfunctional society, is that good? I mean, is that just to partake in the dysfunction? I mean, it seems so easy to say we want justice, but then never discuss what that means, what that looks like, how that affects yourself, your neighbor, your neighbor's neighbor, right? Someone who
Yeah,
you've never met. I mean, it seems so easy to just say we want justice because everyone will like raise their hand, yeah, justice, right? But then like when you start getting into these questions about what justice means, um, justice for some people is like everyone is treated in a way that creates an equal society is justice for some, and for others, justice is my views are prioritized over your views because mine are right and yours are wrong. And
yeah,
yeah, and so it can get really and I think part of the dialogue plays on this, talking about the ambiguity between what justice is and what is meant by people when they say justice, but then don't
right.
discuss what it means.
Yeah, yeah,
That's kind of where I was when you're that's the thoughts that.
yeah. And it does follow really nicely from the Euthyphro discussion, because there we're thinking about, you know, are we using piety, or are we pursuing piety? Are we using piety, or are we trying to understand piety? Right? And it does end up kind of coming up in Plato's understanding of what justice is in some ways. Um, but also, Plato's understanding of justice in the city ends up being used in some really bad ways too. It's complicated to see what exactly is going on in here, because there's very clearly problems with Plato's city. Eugenics among them. So it's concerning, and I've Margaret Cavendish will give an account of justice that feels Platonic in some ways, and also reminds me of something one of our stand-up comedians said recently about people staying in their place, occupying the right place in the structure of society. There's something I think there's something good in what Plato is saying, and there's something really bad in the way people use it. Um, anyway, saying that, hey, having the proper structure in the city means, hey, here's a caste system and don't try to leave your caste. I don't think that's what Plato has in mind. Uh, although, although Plato is giving, uh, he's theorizing about an ideal social structure.
It seems like Plato, and correct me if I'm wrong, is assuming the people in his city are truly selfless, in that the farmer is providing food for, especially at the beginning when there's only like 4 or 5 people in his city,
Right,
that
yeah.
he's providing food for the whole city instead of like making shoes for himself. And so that sort of thing where the shoemaker is making shoes for everyone because that's what's required of his skill.
Yeah,
It just seems like he's assuming the best in this situation, at least at the beginning. I think towards the end it gets a little bit muddy, but when his city is small, it seems like we're assuming the best in these people.
yeah. I mean, interestingly, the healthy city is small. The luxurious city has to grow real big, and the healthy city doesn't even need to start thinking about guardians and armies, and it kind of sounds anarchist to me, but I don't know. It's interesting. Um, yeah. Anyway. So, um, so what do we need justice for? Let's think about this pragmatically for a minute here. If these objections are in some way setting a blueprint for when we find justice, it needs to solve these problems for us, right? When we really understand it, right? If we're looking for it's good to be good, if we're looking for justice is its own reward, uh, we need to be able to get past these sort of things. We need to understand where justice comes from, where it's not just, hey, uh, if I do it this way, I won't get screwed over. And yeah, other people are really kind of motivated to be unjust if they get away with it. Don't trust people if they get a window. But and then how are we going to teach people to be good? How are we going to teach people what these virtues are? Because it very quickly transitions into how do we raise people the right way? And we'll see. It gets even more about that, right? Um, and this also reminds me of the Matrix when you got to catch people young. Because once you're older, it's you're too much a product of your society, and you're too much invested in the structures as they are. Anyway, all right. So we need an account of justice that shows it in the right light. Now, maybe the afterlife is what we're looking for, right? When we see this in the Psalms. Why do the wicked prosper? Oh, well, surely there is a divine vengeance somehow, right? Um, and then in the Quran, it's very clear that uh, one of the things in the Quran and in John Locke on religious toleration, you need to believe in an afterlife and a divine judge. These are the things you need. To have acceptable religion. If you don't believe in an afterlife, if you don't believe in a judgment after death, there's no trusting you. This makes some sense from a Platonic point of view. And you see people who are theorizing about religion, kind of emphasizing these things and using it to show that, hey, no, things look bad, but maybe it's not that bad. But also, hey, we need a way to get along with each other. We need virtue. Maybe an afterlife is the way that we get this kind of virtue. I saw in Pierre Bayle somewhere, he's talking about Spinoza and say, hey, uh, people need to be convinced that it's good to be good, but it's hard to convince people. And maybe the best you can do sometimes is to get people started in this. And maybe you get people started in this by telling nice stories about judgments, about the rewards after everything. Because if we take the people around us as our guide to how to live, we're going to find that the wicked are prospering, and sometimes you can do these awful things and just take and get away with it and get praised for it and use the things you take to get more power and to live a better life. So yeah, it makes sense to some people that, hey, if you deny an afterlife, you are denying that it's good to be good. It makes sense to some people. So Adeimantus comes in and says, guess what? Religion doesn't save us from this. Uh, After all, the gods can be bought. As much as religion, as much as our prophets and our priests and our poets and those inspired are going around telling us, praising virtue, praising piety, praising justice, and telling us that you should be good, they're also going around and selling us ways to uh, uh, ways to make it right. Ways, here, let's do these prayers. Let's offer these sacrifices. Did you do something bad in your past? We can fix this. The gods are against you now. We can fix this. We can get them on your side. Oh, your grandparents lived a vicious life. We can fix this, right? So religion, as much as it'll tell you that you should be good, it will also profit from telling you it's okay that you weren't. Okay. So an afterlife isn't going to fix this. Now, my Christian background, uh, an afterlife isn't going to fix this. Um, oh, so my Christian background is very much uh, all about heaven, pie in the sky. Now, I mean, sometimes it won't be. Sometimes we'll talk about why it's so good to be good. We'll talk about virtue and goodness, and sacrifice as noble in itself and all these things sometimes. But you got to give people the good news. And the good news is not that, hey, it's good to be good. Hey, the poor are blessed. Don't worry about it. Hey, uh, you're living rightly if you're pursuing love. No, the good news is, hey, even if you're bad, you can still have your pie in the sky. And guess what? Actually, everyone is just as bad as you. So just, join our club and have the pie in the sky. And the reason why uh, the biggest motivator here, the biggest sales pitch for right now, let's get you to pray right now, is you don't know when your life's about to end. But there's still, in this theology, in the children hearing this, am I wrong about this, Matt? In the children hearing this, there's still, it doesn't matter if I repent later, as long as I get the chance, I can have more of the illicit pleasures. They're telling me these things are illicit for some reason. Uh, we're not being real clear on what's licit and what's illicit, and it's actually being connected to anything good or bad, right? But let's say something, mm, mm, something very natural, something very okay. Sorry if this is not an example people are here for. Let's talk about masturbation. Um, Now, actually, Plato will tell you that pleasure. Uh, he tells you this here. He doesn't tell you this in some other places, but he tells you here that pleasure will corrupt your soul and make it more bodily and weigh it down. And the goal is to lighten your soul so you can ascend to the gods. All right. So I'm not, even though I'm using Plato to talk about these things, I'm not saying Plato's got everything right here. But let's you got a biological urge, you got hormones pumping through you, uh, and you can have some pleasure without harming anyone. Um, but it's a sin. I was very much told this is a sin. Uh, don't engage. Don't participate because living a life of sin could get you in hell. So you better repent later. You better repent. So how much sin in your life until you repent? Ultimately, right? This is kind of a gambling game. It's a push your luck game. Sure, you can have all the illicit pleasure and pie in the sky too if you time it just right. But what if you get it wrong? Right? You better not. You better not. You better not. But then they'll also tell you, oh, you know what? If you're thinking of it this way, maybe you're not thinking of it right anyway. But then maybe you're not presenting it right. If you're presenting the reasons why I should be good are anyway, maybe the reason really has everything to do with love and not with, I don't know, whatever. Maybe if we really understood what made good actions good, we wouldn't have these problems. If maybe if people weren't using it, what are they using it for? Power, status, standing, status quo, whatever. Parenting without being uncomfortable. Parenting without being uncomfortable is a big one. Anyway, maybe if we weren't using it and we were really thinking about it and speaking the rude truths when they're rude truths to speak about what's actually not bad and that's just controlling people and messing people up, then we wouldn't have these problems. But anyway. So Adeimantus says, hey, since we can appeal to the gods and still, live a life that like lines up that's pleasing to them, we can get them back on our side. We can get the consequences that we were after. We can have the reputation. Then, yeah, religion's not going to save us from this either, right? So the only thing that we can do here, right, is think about justice clearly enough, carefully enough, maybe creatively enough, that it becomes clear why it's good to be good, why justice is a quality that makes your life better. Now, interestingly, Socrates says, I don't know if I can do this. I'll try, but you didn't like what I said to Thrasymachus, and I don't know if I have much more to say to Thrasymachus. Now, what he said to Thrasymachus, I think, the part that stood out to me is more or less virtue kind of binds us together and helps us help each other, and vice kind of forces us apart. And there's a pre-Socratic somewhere, I forget which it was, who says that there's two fundamental forces in the world, and that's love and hate. And love is kind of like gravity that brings things together, and hate or enmity is kind of like the Big Bang force that pushes everything away. So it's these forces that are operating in the world, and these forces socially, right? Love brings us together, makes us stronger. More people brought together into unity, more, we can do more, we can help each other, and enmity pushes us apart. All right, anyway, maybe that's all there is. So when Plato says, hey, I might not have anything more to offer than what I said to Thrasymachus, maybe he's giving us the deep truth there, and the rest of this we should interpret according to that in some way. I think that might be right. Oh, interestingly, also, he says that injustice is actually what corrupts the youth. Unjust religion. This is Adeimantus. It's in 365a. When all such sayings about the attitudes of gods and humans to virtue and vice are so often repeated, Socrates, what effect do you suppose they have on the souls of young people? Right? When you tell people, why you need to repent is so you don't go to hell and so you can go to heaven, even though you're living a pretty loving life here. What does that tell people? Right? When you tell them, hey, love your neighbor as yourself, but then you also tell them, repent or you're going to hell. What are we telling them about the value of love here? Anyway, yeah. So what's corrupting the youth? Well, telling the wrong stories about the gods seems to be corrupting the youth. All right. So then, once we get an idea, we get an idea about what account of justice we need to give. We start the long process of the Republic, the account of the Republic, which is to give an account of justice in the city. Justice is justice, right? This is a Platonic thing, right? There are the forms: goodness, justice, beauty, all of these things that aren't really things. They're not objects you can point at, right? You don't go to a museum to see beauty itself. You go to the museum to see things that participate in beauty. So justice, wherever you find it, is going to be the same. We can think about justice by thinking about the just person, or we could try to understand justice by thinking about the just city. So he makes this analogy, if your eyesight's bad and if you can find it in big letters. So let's look at justice in the city, he says, which is really interesting. All right, so justice in the city then. He starts to give an account of what the city is. And justice maybe is a quality that emerges, right? Justice isn't, the cobbler, but maybe when we think about how the city comes together, we'll find justice there. And again, I think actually this makes some sense with what he says to Thrasymachus about justice being what ties us together, right? Justice is going to be the thing that makes the city function properly, maybe, right? The thing in you that helps the city to function properly, maybe. Okay, so we get a city. Let's get some people who make some things. We need to eat, we need shelter, we need tools. Well, we shouldn't all be responsible. And I always think of like watching Little House on the Prairie as a kid, right? Which, come to think of it, man, there's a lot of anarchism in there, right? I mean, who's the police? I don't remember people being forced into much, right? These people keep shop. That person's the doctor. That person's making food, right? We got a division of labor based on need and skill. All right, good. And, the more we can do that, the better it'll be. But then we start thinking about other things that we want in a city, other things that we need. If they aren't to suffer hardship, they should recline on proper couches and dine at a table and have delicacies and desserts that people have nowadays, right? When we want to describe a city, the origin of the city, we want to talk about the city that we're after. It says, you want to know about the origin of a luxurious city. Maybe that's not a bad idea. By examining it, we may very well see how justice and injustice grow up in these cities. Yet the true city, in my opinion, is the one we've described, the healthy one, as it were. But sure, let's study a city with a fever, if that's what you want. All right, so Is there justice in a city with a fever? Okay, now, what happens when our city has a fever? We need more things. This isn't really meant to be about autonomy. This doesn't maybe apply to our theme of autonomy, except in seeing where the fucked upness of the society around us comes from and how that's infecting us. You can't yeah. All right. All right. So if we need a city, a luxurious city, the city with a fever, we're going to need more things. We must enlarge our city. The healthy one's no longer adequate. We must increase it in size and fill it with a multitudes of things that go beyond what's necessary for a city. Hunters, artists, and imitators, music, poets, actors, choral dancers, right? We need all of these things. And then tutors, nurses, nannies, beauticians, barbers, chefs, cooks, and swineherds. We need all these things. Uh, we don't have enough stuff anymore. Then we'll have to seize some of our neighbors' land if we're going to have enough pasture and plow land. The land, I suppose, that used to be adequate to feed the population we had, it's not adequate anymore. All right. So once you give a city a fever, once you get a city used to the luxuries, you don't have enough. We need more land. We need more people to occupy that land, to work that land. We won't want our neighbors. Our neighbors will want to seize part of our land as well, too, if we're going to go seizing their land. So if they too have surrendered themselves to the endless acquisition of money and have overstepped the limit of necessities, that's our fever. Okay. So yeah, they're going to want to come after us too. Then our next step will be war, Glaucon, won't it? All right. So in a page, we went from we want more things, we want some luxuries, we want to eat meat, to now we need more land. Now there's war. Now we need an army. Okay. Then the city must be further enlarged, not just by a small number, but by a whole army, he says. Okay, so we want finer things. We want more than we need. Now we need to take from other people. Now we need an army. Now we need to provide for an army. So this fever is getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, right? So warfare exists. Now we've got this whole class of people that are committed, that whose job is not at all providing for the city, whose job is war. All right, so great. Once we've started, so I don't know if we're going to get an account of justice looking at the city with a fever. So now we've got these guardians, and the guardians need to be both gentle, gentle to the people they know, and ferocious, high spirited, quick to fight. So now we need to have people who have a fever. Got a city to have a fever. Now we need people who are quick to fight, but they also need to have this contradictory nature. The kind of nature you find in a dog that is gentle to the people it knows and vicious to the strangers. All right, so now we've got xenophobia built into our city. And people that we want to be vicious. Gosh, this fever is getting worse and worse and worse. How do we get the fever in control? Ultimately, what he's going to do is try to, well, the stories that we tell, right? There's a lot of moderation, but ultimately, when he gives an account of like breaking the fever, we need reason in charge, spirit subjected to reason, and then the appetite subjected to both spirit and reason. We want to keep that appetite under control. We want to not get used to find things too much. We want to make decisions based on what's really good, not just based on what seems good. And then the spirited ones, the ones where rah rah for the nation, rah rah for people who look like us, need to be directed by what's really good, what's really bad, and all that stuff. Anyway, so that's maybe too long and short a thing for justice in the city. But when he starts talking about the stories we tell in such a city about the divine, maybe I want to go back to that and think about, okay, what sort of religion is Plato presenting us with? He says we don't want to tell just any stories about, stories about Kronos being killed by Zeus, for instance, which is exactly the story that Euthyphro in our last reading used to justify prosecuting his father. We want to be careful about the stories we tell about the gods and what the gods are doing, because people are going to use those stories to justify themselves. So, what do we tell people about the gods? What is the appropriate thing to tell people about the gods? Not that they hate, not that not that they're subject to these passions, not that they have such desires.
They don't lie.
They don't lie. The gods are only truthful. They don't want anything. So interestingly, what comes out of this is a kind of perfect being theology. All right. Now, perfect being theology is an interesting thing. It's most closely associated with Anselm and the ontological argument. And this argument, okay, the really bad version of it in Descartes, we'll read later, says that God is a being with all perfections. So we define God. We think about the concept of God as a being with all perfections. And then Descartes says existence is a perfection. And so God must exist. And then what must God be like? Oh, well, if justice is a good thing, God's just. If truthfulness is a good thing, God's truthful. Power is a good thing, God has all of it. Knowledge is a good thing, God has all of it. Being confined to one space and time, maybe even at a time, it seems like a big limitation. Let's remove that limitation from God. God's everywhere all the time, and so not physical and all that. So we think of the divine as whatever has all perfections. In Anselm, there's this clever argument that this is the only way to think of the divine that makes any sense. If you try to think of the divine as having an imperfection, you get into a contradiction. It is clever. It doesn't convince us usually that there is a God, but it does interesting things. It is a very powerful argument. Most powerful, I think, because setting the stage for this kind of perfect being theology. Of course, problem with perfect being theology, problem of evil. If, the world is the result of a divine being, why is there evil in the world? That's it's tricky. And he has that problem here too. Since God is good, he's not, as most people claim, the cause of everything that happens, but only of a few things, only the good things, right? So God isn't responsible for the evil, Plato says, only for the good. Augustine ends up in the same kind of place. Interesting thing. And Augustine's very much a Platonist in a lot of regards. Okay, but then the perfect being theology here comes not from some kind of ontological argument, certainly doesn't come from his religious tradition. There's no perfect being theology in Homer or Hesiod. It comes from prudence. It comes from what we need of our religion. We need a religion that tells us it's good to be good. We need gods who are only good and good for their own sake, not gods who are lying to get something. God doesn't need anything. If you're really good, your needs are met. It's fine. You're blessed. Right? We want gods who don't engage in the kind of vicious bullshit that we engage in, that are worth emulating. Gods who care about good things and sure, punish bad things, but not, ooh, interesting. The punishment of the gods don't make people worse. The punishment of the gods don't make people worse. That's real interesting. Punishment of in Augustine too, the punishment of the gods don't make you worse. except maybe in a way that's very natural. There's this, so the text I read from Augustine, just, I know I can't help myself sometimes, but the text I read in Augustine most closely is on free choice of the will. And in there, uh, it's really clear that like what makes you miserable is is being vicious. The vice itself is its punishment, right? You do it to yourself. Being unjust separates you from others who are important to you, right? So we need love to be its own reward. We need justice to be its own reward. Um, but then divine justice can't be a thing that like harms people. Okay, so let's see. Let me read a little passage here. If anyone composes a poem about the sufferings of Niobe, such as the one in which these lines occur, or about the house of Pelops, or about the tale of Troy, or anything else of this kind, we must require him to say that these kinds of things are not the work of a god. Or if they are, then poets must look for the kind of account of them that we are now seeking, and say that the actions of the gods are good and just, and that those they punish are benefited thereby. Socrates, I mean, seems to me, on my reading, to be judging Euthyphro, again, in our last reading. He is trying to humiliate quite emphatically, right? He's trying to humiliate Euthyphro, to bring him low, to make him see that he only thinks himself wise, but he's not. Would it? This is just for someone to do, and if the gods encountered Euthyphro, I think Plato would want them to do the same thing, to humiliate Euthyphro, not as a punishment, well, as a punishment that improves. It's productive. Anyway, so any kind of divine punishment, Plato thinks, needs to be restorative in some way. And he does actually in the Phaedo give an account of an afterlife where you go through this cycle of purification and then are reborn to try again. And anyway, it's interesting. Anyway, um, I really like the emphasis on what these what religion does for us, what it does for us, what it ought to do for us, and what the truth does for us too. This long section about whether the divine can lie or not, it's really interesting. And he distinguishes different kinds of lies. And Plato, I used to tell my students that I lied to them all the time. Uh, and I've been seeing this with my kids a little bit too, where Oliver, let's say my younger child will often try to tell me something about something true about a game he's playing, or try to tell me something, only to have my older kids say, "No, that's not right. You're missing this aspect of it. It's not right. The real thing is like this," which crushes my younger child. And I keep trying to figure out what to do with this. How do I help in the right way? Because the thing is, like, truth isn't as lofty as people sometimes think it is. And language isn't capable of that, except maybe in poetry, of those really lofty truths, or of presenting them in all their loftiness. The description, the truth of, I don't know, if I read Euthyphro with someone and say, it doesn't really tell us anything about piety except some things that piety is not. Well, we've had piety together, man. I think that's a lie now. It is about piety. But when I tell people that it's not really about piety, it's not really a lie. It's a partial truth, okay? And I tell them the partial truth not to hide the truth from them, but to help them find the partial truth better. So yeah, a lot of times we ought to be trying to tell the more simple truths. And the people who want to come behind us, no offense to my older child, and say, no, no, that simpler truth is wrong because it's missing all of this other stuff, all of this other stuff. Well, even if all that other stuff is true, it might be distracting us from the simple truth. It might be truth that takes us away from the truth. Similarly, Plato thinks there are falsehoods that take us closer to the truth. The noble lie, he calls these things. Falsehoods that bring us closer to the truth. Religion, for Plato, might be one big noble lie. I mean, he's approaching it. He's approaching it prudentially. He's approaching it pragmatically, thinking about what do these stories tell us? So what kind of stories about the gods, what kind of stories are instructive to us? It's not just like thinking about it in terms of truth and fiction. Again, we're ending right where you started us, Matt. What genre is this? Are we reading this as truth? Are we reading this as fiction?
I was just thinking that too. Full circle.
Yeah. We came full circle in the first one, and we came full circle in this one too. And I didn't plan it this way.
You are so good, Joe.
No, this one's you, Matt. We're coming full circle. What genre do we find the truth in? As a evangelical teenager, I did not want to read fiction. I stopped reading fiction pretty early, actually. I had no taste for it. I was assigned Moby Dick, and I read a couple pages. I'm like, why is it telling us about the inns? I don't want to read about the inns. I tried reading, various great works of literature. I can't find the truth in here. I was so bad at it until I started getting into some science fiction. Actually, maybe one of the first pieces of literature that like really deeply spoke to me might be like Blade Runner and Android's Dream of Electric Sheep. It was about if you're working for the government out there in a capacity that has you hurting other people, watch Blade Runner. Read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. It's about a person who hates himself because of his job, ultimately. And there are some deep truths to communicate there, right? Okay, so where do we find the truth? Where do we find truth about God? Where do we find the truth about virtue? Well, we should think about what these truths are, right? We who are pursuing the stories that tell us the truth, we should think about what these truths are. And maybe it is those simple truths of virtue binds us together, and hate and fear pull us apart. Maybe that is like where we start, and we think about what stories bring this home to us. And yeah, no doubt that Plato's Socrates is thinking about Aesop's fables that teach us what wisdom looks like without teaching us true stories about I don't know, the origins of our nation or something, or the origins of our people or something, right? We don't need all these historical truths. We need stories that tell us what's good, and stories that present goodness to us as desirable. Stories like, I don't know, It's a Wonderful Life, or I was watching The Sound of Music recently for no obvious reasons, and stories that portray being outspoken as a virtue, a dangerous virtue, a virtue to get you in trouble, but a virtue, right? We need to think much more about what our stories should be telling us. And again, I've been railing against print for a little bit, the written word for a little bit, because it makes our stories so inflexible. We can tell the story of Job that tells some deep stories. We can tell stories of Eden that tell some deep truths, but we don't want to tell stories that get hung up on historical details or hey, well, this is the way Homer told us the tale of Troy. So let's, keep doing it that way. We want to be careful. We want to be careful, and we certainly want to be careful about the myths that are being used against us. Uh, and these are largely going to be myths about uh, us as a people, us as a country, all those kinds of things. Anyway, I think that's probably where we should stop now. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I wrote a few things down. I'll try to go through them quickly. I wanted to talk a little bit about when I think when you were talking about the pie in the sky. I know for a lot, and this was my tradition, and perhaps you can identify with this, where it seemed like being good felt more like avoiding the bad, and that
Yeah,
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 in order to get to heaven, it felt more like you were avoiding going to hell. You know what I mean?
yeah, yeah. It's a purity kind of thing, right?
Yep,
And it does come from Plato too. It's bad stuff
yep,
comes from Plato too,
yep.
where Plato says, "Hey, there's a part of you that's physical, and there's a part of you that's spiritual. And if you feed the part of you that's physical, pleasure, it's going to drag you down. It's going to weigh you down."
Yep.
Now, he doesn't say because that puts you in this grasping place where suddenly to feed your appetites or for the society to feed its appetites, now we've got a standing army ready to go to war. I mean, if that's what it's about, if we can combine that, bodily stuff weighing your soul down with the war machine, I can get behind that story. But if this is about what you're doing with your body and in your closet, I don't I don't
Yeah,
know about
almost.
that.
Yeah, right. It almost felt like when as the city grew, it almost felt like he was saying these big cities are a problem,
Mm.
and as these cities grow, right, we yearn for more. We yearn to grow, right? It felt like
Yeah,
he was almost felt like that was the point, was that these big cities were a problem, and maybe to bring that into our time, I don't. It feels like a lot of the big cities are more inclusive, I guess. We get more diversity and cultural and cultures and people, and as you're exposed to these, you get enlightened, I guess, for lack of a better term. So it's
yeah.
kind of
Well,
this weird, I don't know, dichotomy, I guess, of where, and maybe that's a misreading. So yeah,
I don't know. I mean, it is interesting. Yeah, does the size? How much does the size matter? And I've been thinking about this lately, and I've been thinking about populations and this quote from Confucius that I shared on TikTok a couple times. I think this says, "Look, we've arrived at this new province. When you already have a lot of people, what's the next priority? And it's to enrich the people and then to teach them morals. Okay, we want a lot of people. Why do we want a lot of people? Because you can do more. You want a lot of people because then you can do more. Now, if the more that you're doing is let's make an army and start getting more land and see if we can get those other people off of their land and defend ourselves from them because we're attacking them, that's a problem. But more people is not a bad. More people is more possibility, more power, more that can be done. Now, but it takes organization. It takes control. And that's where there's maybe some contradictions that are impossible, right? Because as much uh, as you can avoid a lot of these fevers, you can avoid a lot of these social vices by controlling and organizing your city right. The control and organization introduces its own problems. Control is a hard thing. So yeah, like you want you want a large population we should want more people because then there's more possibility. But then, yeah, the organization of it gets complicated. Now, I think maybe thinking about it in terms of like, you know, your local Chinese restaurant versus Panda Express, uh, in those terms, right? Yeah, the city seems more inclusive in some. You walk, you go to the local restaurants down the street, where out in the suburbs or out in the country, you're gonna drive places. You can be insulated from people. Maybe you don't know anyone at all. You go to uh, I don't know, maybe you're getting your food from ultimately, people countries away, or where you're getting your food is not feeding any uh, farmers, any producers. Like the money's all going to a corporation that is then making armies to fight other corporations. Like the fever gets way out of hand way quick. I don't know if the size is the issue. Um, because I do think even in a big city, you can find the little neighborhood, the little borough that's like kind of can be functioning that way, can be functioning as a little healthy society. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's fevers everywhere now. What do we do with that? We know we're not getting rid of injustice. We're not getting rid of war. Um, but we shouldn't confuse war with justice.
Yeah,
Anyway,
it seemed I'm glad you brought up power because I was interested in it felt like when when they were talking about only telling good stories about the gods, it almost felt like propaganda, maybe.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and talking about how like God's not responsible for evil, but if these gods are like perfect and all powerful, then how can they not be? That kind of sort of thing.
I
Um,
think I think in some ways what Plato is I think this text is maybe suggesting, I don't know, this is me, this isn't the text, but I think the text is suggesting that our stories about the gods are always going to be used as propaganda, right? I mean, Euthyphro is in there saying, hey, look, Zeus killed his dad, so I'm gonna, get my dad arrested and take over the state. I mean, that's get my reading. Uh, yeah, he's using it. You rob it of the propaganda power when you make it only usable for virtue. Yeah, it's still propaganda, right? Yeah, it's still controlled.
yeah,
Um, but also, this is a book uh, that's ultimately meant to be about how to be a just person and why to be a just person, and describes what a just city might look like. Okay, it's got to be a huge feverish city. Maybe, okay, it's not going to be just at all anyway. But decides, it tries to argue of what the justice we'd be looking for in a city like that. Not, I think, so we pursue it, but so we understand it and see to the extent to which it's not there, right? Anyone who tries to make Plato's Republic is a eugenicist, and yeah, a fascist in some ways, right? I think, but uh, someone who thinks through what type of society to make by reading Plato's Republic, maybe will get closer to justice than anything we have.
yeah. I think there's a plausible reading of the dialogues of Plato that could be interpreted as a sort of propaganda themselves. If we consider that these maybe didn't necessarily and I'm not using like I know there's a stigma around the term propaganda, but there can be good propaganda. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
maybe propaganda isn't quite the right word, but there is, certainly maybe propaganda is a bad word. Let me just say that there's certainly a point that can be taken from this that drives home meaning in a way that probably couldn't have otherwise. Maybe that's a better way
Yeah.
to put it.
So maybe what we need to be looking for in our next reading is what is the difference between, say, trying to direct us towards virtue and propaganda, and using control maybe, or using our stories to try to portray virtue in the right light versus propaganda. What's the difference? Let's see if I'm reading about the nature of the good. In we're skipping a little bit of Republic, but we're moving on to read about the nature of the good. Let's see if it answers that question for us. I think it might.